So I'm Alexandra Bush, and I head up our HEI Higher Education Institute and Research Institute engagement from Oxentia. And Hamish, if you want to just introduce yourself quickly, and then I'll talk about some of the format for today.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Hamish McAlpine. I'm a principal consultant at Oxentia, but I've not been here as long as Alex. I work very closely with Alex, particularly in our work in the HE sector. Prior to joining Oxentia in December, I was the head of data and evidence at Research England, part of UKRI, where I worked on, amongst other things like the knowledge exchange framework, the distribution of funding and related policy, which included quite a bit of work we did on ecosystems. And I guess that's what prompted the topic of today's webinar, really, wasn't it, Alex? So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, so obviously I've been at Oxentia since 2013, so I have a good background of the work I've done with Oxentia and really engaging with different ecosystems internationally and in the UK. But Hamish and I have been talking a lot over the past few weeks around the ecosystems, and really I've jotted down a few questions I've got for Hamish today. So at the end of this session, we're going to answer questions that you may have. So feel free, as we're discussing about innovation ecosystems, to put some questions into the chat room, and at the end of the session we'll look through those questions and try to answer as many as we can at the end, but we'll wrap up at around 4:45 for sure. So if we don't answer all of them, then we'll make sure that we can have a means to be able to answer them in some format after this webinar. So without further ado, my first question really to Hamish is around the whole idea of ecosystems and innovation ecosystems in particular have been getting lots of attention, and just wanted to know what you think makes one, Hamish.
I think that's a really good starting point, because you're right. I think a lot of attention's been kind of focused on ecosystems. There's got a bit of buzz around the topic at the moment. I think there's often an implicit assumption about what they consist of, and I think, as it's been clear in our conversations, different people think of different things. I particularly like James Moore's definition. This is a fairly old one from a Harvard Business Review article years ago. And that talks about a loosely interconnected network of companies and other entities that co-evolve capabilities around a shared set of not just technologies, but also knowledge or skills, and work cooperatively and competitively. And I think that really encompasses a lot of the concepts that people would recognise as being relevant. And then more recently, there have been other definitions that talk about the importance of bringing together various types of three things. So the first one being actors, be that businesses, universities, research institutes, local or regional authorities, entrepreneurs. The second sort of axis being around infrastructure, so things like lab space and other physical infrastructure that's attractive to businesses, like incubators, accelerators. And the third kind of axis being around services, so the wider regulatory and political environment these things sit in, access to finance and that type of thing. I also think in sort of defining ecosystems, when sort of going through the concept, I think it's really important to take a broad view of what innovation is. So for sure, it's about science and engineering being brought to bear to solve problems. But more and more often, you'll find a mix of companies and people and all these elements coming together around a common problem. And whether you're talking about a new technology or a wider sort of societal challenge, there's always that human element. So I think one thing you'll definitely be hearing more about is in ecosystems is around SHAPE. This is an acronym that stands for social sciences, humanities and the arts, for people in the economy. It's a kind of social sciences version of STEM, I guess, if you like, phrase coined by the British Academy. And I think more and more we see that healthy innovation ecosystems have these subjects as at their heart and not as an afterthought. And I guess that's one thing we've seen through our work on the Aspect project, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, definitely, in terms of the engagement across the multidisciplinary area, but yeah, really bringing together the arts and humanities communities across multiple universities across the UK. And it's definitely something that we're seeing internationally, a pull towards wanting to have more engagement in that social sciences sector. Moving on a little bit from that area of our discussion, that was more about the people involved and the infrastructure and bringing that all together for an ecosystem to thrive. Looking a bit more about the geography and in terms of place. So what do you think about the focus being on the regional innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the literature previously has focused on ecosystems in a really broad sense, but I think geography or place clearly plays a huge part. So, you know, even more so recently in the UK with the government's sort of so-called levelling up agenda, which aims to ensure people in all parts of the UK have, you know, access to the opportunities they need to succeed. But I think that's for a multitude of reasons, really. And I think the whole kind of the regional innovation ecosystems in this webinar is really important, and I think it will grow in importance. So I think firstly, you've got sometimes quite complex historical reasons for ecosystems clustering around a place. So that might be
like Silicon Valley we hear about all the time, don't we? But that's just a case study that everybody really kind of hones to. But there are so many other regional innovation ecosystems now, aren't there, that we can really draw from, even from within the UK and all the other countries that we're working in. We're seeing that these complex regional innovation ecosystems are really growing. But sorry, Hamish, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, that's all right. No, I mean, Silicon Valley's the kind of, you know, the really like textbook example, isn't it? But a lot of that was kind of stimulated around the kind of research draw of Stanford, wasn't it? So, you know, it could be a university doing excellent research, it could be a large company, it could be a large company in the supply chain, and people start coalescing around that supply chain. But I think remember also that despite, you know, us all working, you know, largely virtually for the last couple of years, a lot of innovation just can't be done from home. So you often need labs or specialist facilities, teams of people, and they all exist in places. But I think one of the most powerful reasons and one of the most enduring features of ecosystems being in places is around the kind of economic effects of agglomeration effects. So economies of scale and other productivity gains that come from having this close, dense network. And that means it's more efficient, for example, for venture capital to operate. Those kind of agglomerations might also reduce the risk of fear of failure, make people more entrepreneurial, and breed that kind of entrepreneurial culture, which you see in bucket loads in places like Silicon Valley.
And whether it's Silicon Valley or something more around the pharma industry, so I suppose, you know, the positive effects of innovation ecosystems, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine being developed and having the ecosystem in which to thrive and actually develop that benefits society and the world. But then how might these regional ecosystems benefit the areas that they're actually in?
Yeah, I think that's another really important topic. And I guess I see successful regional innovation ecosystems creating almost like this virtuous circle of not just innovations and the outputs, you know, from their innovative activities, which might benefit people everywhere, but also successful economic outcomes to the regions. And that might lead to, you know, regional growth, good high quality jobs, which in turn attracts more investment. That investment allows regeneration, so, you know, not just fiscal regeneration of you know, previously maybe neglected sites, as you might see in the Northwest, but physical and cultural regeneration. That makes the region a more desirable place to live, makes it more attractive to people with the right skills and talent, but it also gives people who live in that region, local people, more opportunities, and the whole thing just carries on. So you can see those positive effects of really strong, healthy regional ecosystems all over the country. So sure, some are larger and more well-developed than others, but everyone all plays their part. I mean, just taking the example of the Oxford ecosystem and the role that the University of Oxford plays with that, 80 spin-out companies, nearly 2,000 people directly employed just in the region, many more jobs created in the wider supply chain and the regional economy as a result of that. So absolutely, they have an impact through their innovations, but also just through the kind of economic effects of them attracting that investment.
So earlier you mentioned the UK's levelling up agenda, and that does sound as though it resonates with this concept too. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think we haven't perhaps quite entirely bottomed out in the UK what levelling up means, and, you know, like ecosystems, it seems to mean slightly different things to different people. But if we think about the kind of core idea of creating prosperity in all regions in the UK, I think that will sound like a familiar challenge to people watching this from outside of the UK too. I mean, I won't pretend that strong, healthy innovation ecosystems are the cure for all ills, but particularly for regional innovation ecosystems, I think what sets them apart from this more kind of generic idea of business innovation ecosystems is the importance of the ecosystem in its place. But also, I think really important to that is that they don't become a kind of, I don't know, a sort of elitist bubble, but they are inclusive and diverse in their approach. And then they take care, the ecosystem takes care to nurture those benefits and make sure they're felt by everyone who lives in that region. So they're not just serving the people who are within that, very actively involved in that particular ecosystem.
And I suppose also they become joined up and they've got their regional ecosystem, but then they do start to connect across to other regional ecosystems, and then it becomes more of a national effect. And that just has a domino effect in terms of spreading more innovation and more ideas. Otherwise, as you said, they become isolated if they're in their bubble. But actually it's reaching out and ensuring that they've got the reach and the diversity and the skills and the training to really develop and thrive as an innovation ecosystem. So going back to what you're saying there, about with the UK and the universities getting better at this, can you give examples then about regional ecosystems in the UK?
So I mean, there's obvious examples like the one I'm sitting in here in Oxford at the moment, which has that huge economic impact and has driven enormous amounts of investment. And you're right, and when you get those kind of such strong ecosystems that they reach from the regional to the national, and suddenly that's when you get really identified areas of kind of world-class impacts coming out of the UK, the kind of things highlighted in the innovation strategy around life sciences, for example, and the contribution of ecosystems to that's really strong. But they are spread around the UK. I mean, various sizes and stages of evolution, like I said. But I mean, ones that spring to mind are the really kind of emerging creative and tech cluster around Bath and Bristol in the southwest. You've got compound semiconductors in South Wales. A lot of activity around advanced manufacturing in Sheffield and the northeast of the UK, where you've got places like the Sheffield's AMRC working together with some really large kind of primes and other large manufacturers there. I think success breeds success in these things as well. So they might be at different stages of evolution, but the successful people, the kind of early wins that those ecosystems have, those people often really want to give back. And there's a really fantastic example I saw last month, a guy called Harry Destacqua from the University of Bristol, and he co-founded Xylo, which is a University of Bristol-based spin-out that was acquired fairly recently by Novo Nordisk. But that's a great success for the ecosystem. But since then, Harry's gone on to create a new venture fund, Science Creates Ventures. He's opened a new incubator space in Bristol. Both of those things will help overcome some quite specific barriers in that region around access to finance and quality lab space. Then he's also, going back to, how do they benefit the communities that they're based within? He's also started an educational charity for outreach to better engage with the wider community, and all that from one spin out. And then you see the number that places like Oxford have produced and think you multiply that, the effect that one spin out's had, and you start seeing how universities can really boost that local regional innovation ecosystem and really make a huge contribution to it.
I said I was going to answer some questions at the end, but I think there's a quite interesting question we could probably weave into answers now, in terms of interested in whether you think ecosystems are best created top down by central government or bottom up more spontaneously, or perhaps a bit of both. And my perspective is, I think a bit of both. I think that it has to be some funding from central government. I think then there has to be the drive and the infrastructure and means to create something from the bottom. So from both sides, I think the regional ecosystem has to be developed. But Hamish, interested in your views there too.
Yeah, definitely. It's not completely one or the other, but I guess I'd struggle to see how a kind of top-down approach would work from scratch. So kind of in my mind, if you think about the sequencing of that, you'd probably see some nascent activity or some historical reason why there's a particular capability in an area. So I'm thinking here like the kind of, the ex-chemical industry in the Northwest and around Chester and the ex-ICI stuff. There has to be some kind of conditions which mean that might be a sensible place for activity to happen, or some kind of imperative for a new ecosystem to be developed. But then, at some point, as that scales and grows, there might become apparent things which are limiting that ecosystem, which are outside the control of the actors, of the players within it, which needs more coordinated government support. So I guess it's definitely both, but different kind of shifting from the top down to the bottom up at different stages of their life cycle, I guess would be my answer.
And different players within that ecosystem who want to drive it forward, which I think moves nicely into my next question about the role of universities more widely. And one thing that I've seen with universities is that they are driving a lot of growth in this sector in terms of if universities built a new medical school and they want to build more links regionally with whether it's the pharma industry or it could be med tech in general, devices, just growing a whole ecosystem around their research themes. And you could think about that with the other sectors, so aerospace, building a cluster of aerospace knowledge. So I think in terms of building the regional innovation ecosystems, universities obviously have a significant role. And what do you think, Hamish, about the role of universities more widely?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with all of that. And I think, I'd have often referred to universities as kind of regional anchors and anchor institutions. And maybe it's an overused term, but I still think it illustrates that point, that sometimes they do have really great convening power and they can bring people together. They can bring all those elements of the ecosystem together quite effectively. What springs to mind in my previous role at UK Research and Innovation and Research England, was lucky enough to have led on the development of England's first knowledge exchange framework, the KEF. And as part of this, universities submitted evidence around the impact of their activities on local growth and regeneration. And there are absolutely loads of examples in those narratives about this impact being realised through their involvement in the regional innovation ecosystems. It was almost rarer to kind of hear of something happening in isolation. It was always in partnership with, and we worked with these people. And that was true of all types of universities, from the very, the tiny art specialists to the really large research intensive institutions. It's definitely worth checking those out.
Any in particular that stood out to you?
The one that kind of springs to mind, it was absolutely loads, and I'd really encourage people to go and have a look at them. I think they're a really interesting collection of examples of the kind of stuff we're talking about. I guess one is Imperial College's White City campus. That provides a kind of focus to the university's activities in the far west of London. I think it's a great example because, firstly, when people think of levelling up in the UK context, they might think about those kind of the post-industrial north of the UK. But there's also a lot of health and quite large wealth disparities in big cities like London, and I'm sure that's the same all over the world. And secondly, it's not just about, despite Imperial being, world-leading, extremely research-intensive university, it's not just driving that kind of research and that really high-tech stuff, but it's also about regeneration, the physical and the cultural regeneration, but also through the delivery of things like hack spaces. That campus is making itself accessible to the wider community. The community can see what's going on, and they can get involved in really tangible ways. And I think that's a nice example. And I think what's happening there really is, I guess they're thinking about their broader civic mission as universities. So things around like widening participation to higher education, attracting and training talented entrepreneurial people. They can't do this in isolation. So I think, as an integral part of what universities are thinking about in terms of delivering, their civic mission and wider societal benefits, I think it's only right they invest and participate in their regional ecosystems. I do think it's important they take time to think about how to communicate what they're doing. And I think this is why I like the KEF so much. It gave us the opportunity to kind of showcase in some ways what's going on in universities. I don't think that's always that visible. I think in general, they're getting better at that, but I think there's still more to be done, in my view, around that.
And in terms of the innovation ecosystems, there's a sense that we can sometimes be compared, the UK with the US, but how do you think that the UK compares internationally?
So we do get compared to the US a lot, and I saw that in my previous role. It was a real topic of interest amongst government and policymakers. My view of that is I'm not saying the UK doesn't have its challenges and that more can't be done, particularly about this levelling up, about spreading success more evenly, across the university sector and across, geographically across the UK. But on quite a lot of the measures, we stack up quite well, actually. And I think other countries have similar challenges around, geographic concentration of wealth or opportunities. I don't think this is a uniquely UK problem by any means. But I do think we have, globally competitive research in many areas. We have 5 UK universities in the global top 10 for the capital raised by the spin-out companies. That's a huge testament to the kind of success of some institutions in being really effective in commercializing and capitalizing on their ecosystems. So I think on the whole, the data shows we're broadly comparable with the US. What I would say, though, is that healthy ecosystems just make it all easier. So from doing the research in the first place, finding the right opportunities, finding the right way to finance a spin out or some other endeavor, then maybe scaling that spin out, that new business. Just another reason why ecosystems play such an important part in that.
And do you think that it's moving a little bit, it's not off topic, it's definitely within the topic, but I think given the current situation with the pandemic and COVID, do you think that there have been a significant number of challenges and opportunities that have arisen because of COVID within these ecosystems? What do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities presented by COVID?
I mean, I think challenge for sure. There's been plenty of that, and I saw that in my previous sort of policy-facing role, and the effect it had on institutions was really quite profound in some cases. So particularly when we talk about universities and businesses collaborating, particularly during periods of lockdown, we can already see in the data through things like reduced use of specialist facilities and equipment in universities. That's one negative impact. You just physically weren't able to be co-located together.
As I was asking that question, Hamish, so as I was asking that question, another question came in about, great discussion. And do you think that geographical ecosystems are under threat from increasing digitalisation, which I think links into what we're discussing here now? Yeah,
definitely related. I think what I was going to say is just the sort of negative sentiment about sort of future R&D spending. Although I think, we've only really seen the beginning of the effects of this. And I think it'll take years to play out. I think in terms of that digitalisation, yes, to a degree, but so much of it, I think you lose the sort of agglomeration benefits of that close and dense network. And I think so much of it does have to be done in person because you need the facilities access, or I'm a great fan of the kind of serendipitous interactions you get from having a dense network of people. I think digital technology has come a long way, and it's come probably further in the last 2 years than the last a decade before that. But I still think there's a place for regional ecosystems, even within the region. Doesn't mean you can't be communicating largely digitally, but I still think you may have a regional focus and a regional grouping for all the reasons we've discussed before.
And then a bit of a change of tact again around advice that you might give to someone who's looking at developing or growing their regional innovation ecosystem. What advice would you give?
So I think it's really important to note that whilst there might be perhaps really influential organisations or even individuals within regional innovation ecosystems. I think the key seems to be really bringing together this very wide range of things. So academics of all types and all disciplines, thinking about shape versus STEM, there's room for everyone to participate on equal footing. Entrepreneurs, venture capital for sure, access to finance more generally in whatever form is appropriate, super important, but also not forgetting those other local stakeholders, and bringing together this really wide range of things around a common purpose. So, from what I've seen of Oxentia's work in the time I've been here, we've helped to do that through, for example, accelerator programs, working with Wiltshire Council, with SMEs here in the UK, but also bringing innovators together with people all over the world through our accelerator programs and things like that. I guess to do this effectively, one really needs to know also who and what already exists, how they work together, what might be lacking, what might need to be reinforced. That could be anything from a kind of lack of access to finance, lack of support or space for businesses to grow, the wrong sort of space, such as the lack of wet labs, and then sort of identifying who can help overcome this. So I guess from a practical perspective, it's having that kind of doing that mapping, having that deep understanding of where the strengths and where the gaps might be and what form those gaps take. I'd also say it's a great idea to look at what other ecosystems are doing, but super important, and this is really well documented. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that one can simply replicate a successful ecosystem in a different place. You just can't kind of, cut and paste Silicon Valley to somewhere else. And I think, at risk of sort of stretching the ecosystem kind of analogy too far, if you think about ecosystems in nature where we've borrowed this concept from, they often have really complex and hidden interdependencies, and as I said, that cutting and pasting is just very unlikely to work in the long term. So for sure, learn from the success of other ecosystems all over the world. There are loads of good examples of that, and some are more similar to other ecosystems than others. So pick the right ones to compare yourself to in terms of size and stage of evolution, or perhaps the kind of focus of them, would be that around technology or broader challenges. So yeah, really important, map that out, deep understanding of that and its components. I think that's where companies like Oxentia can help, from what I've seen. I also think, where one wants to grow, for example, capabilities to identify or translate or accelerate ideas into new businesses and ecosystem. Again, I think Oxentia's expertise of doing this all over the world can really, kickstart your own initiatives there. So yeah, I don't think there's any one thing, but I think it's really, to summarize, I think it's rooted in that deep understanding of what the ecosystem is, what it can offer, and where the gaps might be, and how others have addressed them, and is that something that you can replicate?
That seems like a really good place to leave it at the moment. So I think we'll have a look in the chat box, see if there are any questions there. And if you've got more questions, please put them into the chat box now. As I said earlier, if we don't have time to get through them all today, then they will be put out with the recording of the webinar. And John said that we'll send that around tomorrow. We might send that a bit later, but it will definitely be sent out in the next week. So I'll just go to this question here from, is it from Hannah? So how do you propose local entrepreneurial talent and skills are retained within communities to facilitate innovative development and regional ecosystems? So retention of talent and skills. I think that's a really, really important question. I think there are incentives. I think there can be certain incentives around the place, because you need to foster the skill set to remain in that innovation ecosystem. But I think it's in terms of having the infrastructure in place that people want to go to that place. I'm thinking as I'm speaking here, so I might just take a moment to think, unless Hamish, you've got something to say at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree with that. I think it's really important. In my mind, it's almost like a chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? So that it's that virtuous sort of circle that ecosystems create. So you might have a university that is producing a load of really talented entrepreneurial graduates that could offer a lot to that ecosystem. So then I guess the challenge becomes, how do you make the place attractive for them to stay in once they graduate, and also attract people to that region? Really hard to do from scratch, I think. But I think, again, thinking about specifically the role of universities as these kind of anchors and conveners, I think they can do a lot through, for example, offering support to graduate startups, startup businesses who stay in the region, also providing, universities themselves providing incubation, acceleration, and other types of support, helping work with local businesses through, European regional development funding has been a huge source of how universities are able to kind of stimulate that and both retain and attract talent in a region. Not sure how that's going to play out in the future, but has been a really important route in the past. But also offering, other support services, maybe, working together through knowledge transfer partnerships, for example. So I think a whole ton of stuff around that. And then I guess on the kind of retention of talent, then the other thing we don't sometimes think about as knowledge exchange, but I certainly do with universities, is the delivery of continuing professional development and upskilling. And that's about, again, the university needs to understand what are the local needs, how can we tailor, CPD and continuing education offerings to the needs of the region in terms of sort of reskilling or upskilling people in that region. I think that can play a really important part too. So.
And then there's another question on, we tend to compare again the US, but what about European innovation ecosystems? I think we just drew upon, Hamish said, the government is doing that. So Hamish, in terms of what you're thinking, you have just come from a role where you are more linked to that. I mean, when we at Oxentia, we compare ourselves with UK, US, it could be Middle Eastern, European. So we as consultancy would compare and benchmark against global innovation ecosystems wherever they are in the world. And we see definitely regional innovation ecosystems in, for instance, in Spain, in France, and Cyprus, wherever it is within Europe, we see great things happening across multiple sectors. And I think that's another thing about being sector specific, can be obviously a good thing, because you want to attract the right skills for that specific sector. But then it's also having diversity across sectors as well, because the more interlinkage you have between sectors, like engineering with aerospace, with some other sector, it's multidisciplinary. It's not just about having one particular theme, it's having the bandwidth to be able to draw upon all of that knowledge to build up the innovation ecosystem. So I think that's what I'm saying about the region. And there's another question here about how we can best link regional innovation ecosystem to global innovation systems. That's absolutely to point, because we have to have diversity to link up and have all of the bandwidth across the knowledge. But Hamish.
I think going back to Mary's question about the US comparisons, I think that is, like you point out, Alex, is driven by the policy interest, and also because of the kind of very overt success of things like Silicon Valley, and the US is obviously looked to as very entrepreneurial and not as risk averse. And the other thing is there's quite easily comparable data. So previously at UKRI we've done. I was responsible for generating some international comparisons, and the US is one country where it's easy to benchmark against. But we absolutely shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that is our comparator. And I think if you look at the characteristics of cities and ecosystems, some in the UK are much more comparable to those in Europe. Harder to get data. There are efforts sort of underway, I'm aware of, to better look at how they compare. But so I think the easy answer to that is that we absolutely, everything I think we've talked about is valid in terms of comparisons with UK and Europe and everywhere else in the world, but the US is the kind of real policy interest one. So I think that's why.
Do you want to pick another question?
Yeah, I'll ignore my previous colleague's really difficult question about ensuring actors interact dynamically to create synergies for a healthy innovation ecosystem. Well, actually, I can say something about that. I think that's a really important topic, and I guess that goes to the heart of like a healthy innovation ecosystem, the characteristics of how people communicate. I think a lot of that is down to individuals and how they're set up and how they're funded. And I think you see in different regional ecosystems different balances of power and kind of policy drivers. The thing there, I think, is I don't think you can dictate how people should interact and communicate within an ecosystem. I think that has to be completely done on the basis of what's best for them and what the particular dynamic is. I mean, for sure, you can do things to encourage it. So like a little bit of resource often goes a long way, especially when you're talking about, public bodies. I think some actors in those ecosystems have this natural convening power. And again, I'm thinking of universities where they might be a relatively neutral space to bring, for example, different organizations who might be ordinarily competitive with one another together. And things like that. I think very hard to dictate. I think it has to be organic, and I think it has to be, really responsive to the dynamic of that particular ecosystem.
And there's another one just above that around best linking regional ecosystems to global innovation ecosystems, and I think that's all around. So having the right connections and the communication piece, and definitely having the networking to be able to reach out to the right contacts within those relevant ecosystems to really draw out the best that you can from the research or work that you're doing, whether it's manufacturing or research. I think that linking those regional ecosystems to global is really about the connectivity and knowing the right stakeholders within those systems. And some of it will come down to funding, some of it will be about developing partnerships, but it's definitely about reaching out and communicating. And if you've got an ecosystem that's already healthy and thriving, obviously it'll be easier to then connect with those players internationally. And we see that through work that we do. If we've supported the accelerator programs in, let's say, Colombia, and then linked up some of those innovators with the players that we see in Europe or in the UK. So that's starting to develop from a regional to a global innovation ecosystem. So I think it's just about the connectivity and making sure you've got all of the pieces aligned that you can form a stronger global innovation ecosystem.
I think that's also where government policy in the UK and other countries comes into play a bit. So whether that's through, immigration systems that support the, easy transfer of talent between countries, or, sort of broader policies that may help or hinder that connectivity. Yeah. Again, some of it's historical, very historical links we have with some countries in terms of our scientific collaboration. But that's where I think you are into the realms of, some of this is down to kind of government policy, particularly around movement of talent. So
yeah, and we did some work with the Global Innovation Policy Accelerator as well. So that was supporting senior people within the scientific and research. So this is SHAPE and STEM across all areas of research, how they could lobby their own governments in building better innovation policies that could attract more international collaboration. So there's an element of chicken and egg, you just said that. So other examples of new clusters, ecosystems in the UK that don't have long histories to learn from or build upon. This appears to be confounding for levelling up on different levels.
It's a good question. I think there's always some history, and I guess some of the newer ones, what you think of as maybe a more emergent ecosystem, it still may have a kind of a past history, but there's been a need to reinvent that because what's gone before isn't now working for that region. So again, I'm thinking of like Chester and the loss of parts of the chemicals industry, and then there's a need for reinvention, or to pivot to a different kind of offering. How is this region going to be prosperous in the future? Where does its future lie? And I think they're the ones I'd maybe look for. So they still have history, and it could be there that you've got large amounts of brownfield land that can be redeveloped into life sciences labs, for example, or to support creative or tech industries. But I think my observation there would be it still happens gradually, and then it happens suddenly. So there's still this kind of low-level rumbling of stuff going on. It may just start with a university, a couple of businesses, or the region being lucky enough to attract a large local employer, or again, government policy coming into play. Maybe they've made a strategic decision to locate a particular large investment in that region. So things like Henry Royce at Manchester, and some of the larger sort of UK capital investments in research infrastructure. And then there's always a rationale for them being in a place, but then suddenly that might really kickstart, that one big investment might really kickstart and catalyze a lot more activity. So yeah, slowly chip away, maybe not much happens, and then bang, things take off, they get recognition, and you get into that, success breeding success cycle again.
I think that's probably all we've got time for today. Thank you everybody for the questions that you've posed to us this afternoon. We hope you've enjoyed joining in the discussion. Hamish, any closing thoughts from you?
I don't think so. I think we're pretty much out of time, but just thanks for all the great questions. I think it was really, really interesting. It kind of builds on all the discussions we've had really, really well, doesn't it, Alex? And it's certainly got me thinking about a few things. As we said, we'll send out the recording, and we'll try and address any points we don't think we kind of fully bottomed out in that discussion. Other than that, do get in touch if you think Oxentia can help. Please get in touch via oxentia.com and the contact information on the website. And it'd be really great to see people at future webinars, or indeed future in-person events, of which I hope there'll be a few more this year. So thank you.